The apartment was unusually still. Outside, the city hummed with its usual end-of-day rhythm, but inside, the silence felt intentional, deliberate, like the pause before a curtain rises. Elena moved through the space with quiet certainty. She wasn't rushing. Every gesture, lighting the candles, folding the napkins, adjusting the placement of the wine glasses, felt almost ceremonial. She didn't wear perfume. Only the faint scent of orange blossom from the soap earlier that afternoon still clung to her skin. It was enough. Tonight wasn't just a dinner. It was a reckoning. The invitation had been delivered in the simplest of ways. A group message. No flowery words, no explanation, just time, place, and a quiet expectation that they would come. And they would. She knew they would. Caleb had always responded to her silences better than her words. He would come, maybe hoping that tonight would mend what had unraveled between them. Marcus, older and more careful with his emotions, had not responded to the message at all. But she sensed something in him, a curiosity perhaps, or a resignation. He would come. Noah had never pretended to understand her. But he had always watched her like someone who did. Like someone who saw not just what she said, but what she withheld. If he arrived, it would not be out of obligation. It would be a choice. She stood in front of the mirror, smoothing her dress, simple, off-shoulder, soft to the touch. Not revealing, but not concealing either. It wasn't for them. Not entirely. It was for the version of herself she had tucked away too long. Dinner was nearly ready. The scent of roasted vegetables filled the air, gentle and comforting, layered with thyme and lemon. A bottle of wine rested on the counter, breathing quietly. The table was set for 4, and just as she lit the final candle, a sound interrupted the stillness. 3 knocks, sharp, precise. Measured. She didn't flinch. She walked to the door, composed, barefoot on the wood floor. Her fingers curled around the handle. Tonight wasn't about forgiveness or explanations. It wasn't even about closure. It was about honesty stripped of pretenses, of roles of fear. She opened the door. Marcus stood first, hands in the pockets of a dark coat, his gaze unreadable but present. Behind him, Caleb hovered, hesitant, eyes darting past her shoulder as if searching for an anchor. And then a few steps back, quiet but unwavering Noah. His posture casual, but his gaze held weight. None of them spoke right away. She didn't need them to. She stepped aside. "Dinner is ready," she said simply. They walked in, each crossing the threshold into a room not of comfort, but of truth. And the evening began, not with fanfare, not with greetings, but with a silence that meant everything. The door clicked shut behind them. A hush fell over the space. Not awkward but dense, like the air had shifted ever so slightly. Elena led the way, her step soundless on the wooden floor. She didn't glance back. She didn't need to. She could feel them watching her, the weight of 3 different histories following her into the room. The dining table sat beneath a soft pendant light, casting gentle shadows along the edge of the cloth. It wasn't overly dressed. There were no centerpieces, no polished silver. Just warmth. Just intention. Marcus was the first to approach the table. He rested his hand briefly on the back of a chair before pulling it out and sitting. His movements were steady, careful, the kind of control that came from years of knowing how not to reveal too much. Caleb hesitated longer. His eyes flicked to her, then to Marcus, then to the wine already poured. He took the seat across from her, shoulders tight, jaw set. She could almost hear the questions rising behind his silence. Noah remained standing for a moment. He looked around the space, the open windows, the flickering candles, the plate she had set for him, and then sat slowly. His posture was relaxed, but there was an alertness behind his stillness. Elena met his gaze, and for a moment, she forgot to breathe. I wasn't expecting all of us, Caleb finally said, the edge of a challenge hidden behind a flat tone. Neither was I, Elena replied softly, pouring wine into his glass without looking at him. But here we are. No one laughed. But no one left either. The meal began, not with toasts but with motion. Plates passed, wine glasses filled. Forks lifted and returned to their porcelain landings. The conversation hovered just above the surface, polite and inconsequential: weather, work, the latest book someone never finished. But beneath it, a current pulled strong and certain. Marcus was the observer, always watching, always calculating. His silence wasn't passive. It was the silence of someone who had seen the inside of people long before they spoke. Caleb was unsettled. Every so often, his eyes flicked toward Elena's hand when she reached for the bottle, or toward Noah when he leaned back just a little too comfortably. Noah, he didn't fidget, didn't shift, didn't avoid anyone's gaze. He simply existed there, steady, present, like a question that had already been answered, but no one had dared to speak aloud. Elena moved among them with deliberate grace. She smiled when it was needed. She responded when it was polite. But beneath that, she remained grounded, like someone who no longer had anything to lose. She let her leg drift slightly beneath the table, brushing, just for a second, against Marcus's. He didn't flinch. But she saw it in the way his hand paused before picking up his glass. Caleb's fork froze halfway to his mouth. Noah tilted his head just barely. Something had shifted. Again, and still no one said a word. The knock at the door had been the beginning, but this was the unraveling. Not sudden, not violent, but slow, intentional, like the first crack in a piece of glass, barely visible but inevitable. The clink of silverware became its own rhythm, a quiet, pulsing soundtrack to the unspoken tension stretching across the table. Elena sat with her back straight, her fingers tracing the rim of her wine glass, not out of nervousness but control. She wasn't fidgeting, she was listening. To breath patterns, to silences, to the careful choreography of glances darted and withheld. Noah spoke first. "This wine," he said casually, swirling his glass in the candlelight. "It's familiar." His tone was even, but his eyes were on her. Not searching, not accusing. Just remembering. "You brought it once," she replied, not smiling but not cold. "To a gallery opening. 2 years ago." Marcus raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. His hand hovered near his plate, fingertips resting lightly on the stem of his fork, unmoving. Caleb's knife tapped once against his plate, sharp, rhythmic, like punctuation. "You still remember that?" he asked. "I remember most things that didn't pretend to be more than they were," Elena replied. Her voice was soft, but the sentence lingered in the room like incense, slow to dissipate. The air around them shifted again, almost imperceptibly. A draft passed through the open window, making the flame of the nearest candle waver, casting flickering shadows across their faces. Noah leaned back, his thumb brushing the rim of his glass. Elena's eyes followed the motion, then drifted toward Marcus, who still hadn't touched his drink. "You haven't asked me why we're here," she said. Marcus looked up, calm and measured. "I assumed you'd tell us if you wanted us to know." Elena tilted her head slightly, considering that. Caleb glanced toward her, his posture tense. He wasn't used to this version of her. Quietly certain, undistracted. She could feel him trying to read her, like a book whose language had changed midway through the story. Under the table, her leg brushed Marcus's again. He didn't move away this time. Noah cleared his throat gently, and in doing so, drew her gaze to him once more. There was something grounding in his expression, not longing, not confusion. Just presence. Stillness. "We're here," he said, because we all knew this was coming. Elena didn't reply right away. She turned her face slightly toward the window. From where she sat, she could see the outline of the city, glittering, oblivious. People moving. Lives unraveling and folding back together again. Somewhere out there, dinner tables were filled with laughter and predictability. Not this one. "There are moments," she said slowly, "when you stop pretending not to know. And then you look at the people around you, and you wonder, how long have we all been pretending?" She didn't raise her voice, but the room heard her clearly. Marcus's eyes didn't blink. Caleb exhaled sharply through his nose but didn't speak. Noah sat forward just a little, elbows resting on the edge of the table. So he asked gently, "What do we do now?" Elena stood. Not suddenly, not dramatically. She simply rose, and for a second, the air seemed to follow her. She collected her glass and walked toward the kitchen, slowly, deliberately, letting the silence stretch behind her. She didn't need them to follow. Not yet. Let them sit. Let them stew in it. Let the truth take its shape in their minds before it moved in their bodies. Dinner wasn't over. It had barely begun. The sound of the faucet running in the kitchen broke the stillness like a breath finally released. Elena rinsed her glass, her back to the dining room. She wasn't hiding, only allowing herself the rare permission of turning away. Behind her, chairs creaked softly. Silverware shifted, but no one rose. Not yet. The weight of what was unspoken filled the apartment like steam, rising, swirling, clinging to every surface. She dried her hands on a cloth and lingered by the counter. She didn't need to look to know who was watching. She could feel it. 3 different silences braided together, each one speaking a different language. Caleb's silence was full of resistance. The kind that came when someone who once had the upper hand began to realize the balance had changed. Marcus's silence was composed, as always. But now there was something else beneath it. Not vulnerability, not desire. A curiosity, quiet and deep, like a question that had never been asked aloud. Noah's silence was different. Familiar. Safe even. The kind that asked nothing but offered space. Elena turned finally and walked back into the room. She didn't sit. Instead, she stood beside the table, fingers brushing the rim of an untouched wine glass. "You've all looked at me differently at some point," she said. "And I let you." No one interrupted. "I was convenient. Or distant. Or something you couldn't quite name. But wanted anyway." She looked at Caleb first. "You loved me when I was silent. When I didn't question you. When I played the role." His lips parted but no sound came. Then to Marcus. "You watched. You waited. You never crossed the line, but you let me know where it was. Every time." Marcus didn't deny it. His expression remained unreadable, but his fingers tightened slightly around his napkin. Then to Noah. You never asked me for anything." Noah nodded once, eyes steady. "Because I knew you were still deciding what you wanted." Elena smiled just faintly. A shift in her posture made her look taller somehow. More rooted. She walked slowly around the table now, passing behind Caleb, brushing the back of his chair lightly with her fingertips. He didn't turn to look, but his breath caught. When she reached Marcus, she paused. The light from the overhead lamp framed her face in gold. She didn't speak. She simply placed a hand on the back of his chair, near, not touching, and let it linger. He glanced up at her, and in his eyes was something unfamiliar. Uncertainty. She moved on. By the time she reached Noah's side, the entire room felt rearranged. She stood close, closer than before. Close enough that the warmth between them felt like a question. I used to be afraid of choosing, she whispered, not just to him, but to herself. And now? He asked. She looked down at her hands. Now I'm more afraid of choosing for the wrong reasons. A pause. Then don't choose yet, Noah said quietly. Let it unfold. The moment stretched like silk between fingers, delicate, shimmering, and bound to tear if pulled too hard. Then Elena stepped back, her eyes scanning all three men once more. She didn't look for answers. She looked for clarity. I'll bring dessert, she said calmly. And with that, she disappeared down the hallway, leaving the three men behind, each one caught in a silence of their own making. Not one of them followed her. Not yet, but something had shifted in the air, and none of them could deny it. Elena didn't bring dessert. Instead, she returned with a small tray of espresso cups. Dark porcelain, delicate, imperfect, each filled with just enough to keep them awake and unsettled. She set the tray down with quiet precision, her expression unreadable but entirely present. I thought we could use something a little stronger. Marcus lifted a cup, nodded. Caleb didn't touch his. Noah reached without hesitation. She took her own and remained standing. As the others took cautious sips, she looked at each of them. Not inviting, not dismissing, just studying. And maybe for the first time that evening, letting herself be fully seen. The room was dimmer now. The light had shifted as the evening leaned deeper into night, and the shadows had softened around their shoulders like an old familiar coat. Elena stepped toward Caleb first. His eyes met hers, searching, unsure. Do you remember? She asked, voice like silk drawn tight. The last time you kissed me and meant it? He blinked, unsteady. Of course not out of guilt, she interrupted. Not because it was expected, but because you still saw me. Caleb opened his mouth, then closed it again. There was nothing left to argue. She leaned forward slowly, not provocatively, not defiantly, but with a quiet certainty. Their lips met, just for a moment, not out of longing but memory, the taste of something unfinished. She pulled away before he could deepen it, before it could become something else. Caleb's eyes lingered, but she had already stepped back. She turned to Marcus. He stood, not out of impulse, but out of respect. They said nothing. She simply looked up at him, hands at her sides. Her chin tilted slightly like she was daring him to speak, but he didn't. She moved forward again, closer than before. One hand rose, slowly, cautiously, and touched his lapel. She kissed him too, longer. His hand hovered near her waist but never closed the distance. When she stepped away, his eyes held a question. Not about the kiss, but about what it meant that she could walk away from it so effortlessly. And then finally she turned to Noah. She didn't speak. He didn't move. They just waited. The silence stretched until it felt like breath. And then, without permission or apology, she stepped into the space between them. One of her hands rose to touch his face, not to guide him, but to acknowledge him. A different kind of recognition. When she kissed him, it was neither soft nor forceful. It simply was. Steady, present, grounded. Like exhaling after holding one's breath too long. He didn't pull her closer. He didn't respond with urgency. He just allowed it, and that was enough. When she drew back, her lips lingered near his cheek for a second longer than necessary. Then she straightened. That's enough, she said, not looking at any of them now. For tonight, she turned her back to the table and walked away. No one followed, not because they didn't want to, but because for the first time they understood. This wasn't about seduction. It wasn't about victory. It wasn't even about desire. It was about clarity. And sometimes the most powerful thing a woman can do is leave them wondering. The door to her bedroom closed behind her with the softest click. Not a slam, not a retreat, just a pause, deliberate and full of breath. Elena stood in the darkened room for a long moment, her palms resting flat against the wood. Her breathing was steady, but inside everything hummed, not with regret, not even with pride, but with stillness, a stillness that came after you stopped asking for permission to feel. Back in the dining room, the air hung thick with a different kind of silence. It wasn't the earlier tension, laced with uncertainty and veiled glances. This was quieter, more honest, like someone had turned down the volume on expectation. No one reached for their cups. No one made a move to leave. Caleb sat rigid, elbows on the table, fingers laced tightly, as if trying to hold something together that had already come apart. Marcus leaned back, arms folded loosely across his chest. His expression was unreadable, but his breathing had slowed. He was listening now, not for words but for meaning. And Noah, he had closed his eyes, not in fatigue, not in dismissal, but in something close to understanding. He didn't need to see her to feel what had shifted. Elena, in the other room, sat on the edge of her bed. She didn't undress. She didn't collapse. She simply sat, wrapped in the glow of a single bedside lamp, the golden light softening the sharp corners of her reflection in the mirror across from her. She saw herself, and for once she didn't feel like a character in someone else's story. This was hers, all of it, the pain, the power, the restraint, the choices she made and the ones she refused to. She reached behind her and let her hair fall loose, strands cascading like the unraveling of a question she no longer feared to ask. There were no footsteps in the hallway. No one had followed. She had kissed each of them, but they all understood something now. She didn't belong to any of them, not anymore. Back at the table, Noah was the first to stand. He didn't look toward the hallway. He just pushed his chair in and picked up his coat. Marcus remained seated, one leg crossed over the other, a faint glimmer of something, maybe admiration, passing behind his eyes. Caleb rubbed a hand across his face, as though trying to wipe off the part of him that still clung to the past. None of them spoke. The espresso cooled. The candles flickered. The moment settled. In her room, Elena lay back on the bed, fully clothed, eyes open, hands resting on her stomach. She didn't feel victorious. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt quiet, and that quiet was hers alone. Morning didn't arrive with birdsong or sunrise. It came with the soft thud of a door closing gently. An exit, not an escape. Elena had barely slept. She hadn't tossed or turned, just remained in the stillness of her thoughts, letting them move in and out of her like slow waves. No dreams, no regrets. She heard footsteps, only one pair, fade into the hallway. Then silence again. She rose, not with urgency but with intention. The light in the kitchen was still on. A few cups remained on the table, the wax of the candles now hardened and dull. The air still carried the memory of time and heat, and something else more difficult to name. She didn't clean right away. She simply stood there. In that silence, there was something sacred about the aftermath. What was left when nothing else demanded to be said? What remained after the confessions had been whispered without words? Noah was the one who had left. Of course he had. Not because he was hurt, not because he was done, but because he knew when presence became unnecessary, when staying too long could turn dignity into performance, and that made her ache a little. Not in longing but in admiration. She poured water into a glass and drank slowly. Her reflection in the dark window showed a woman who looked familiar but different. Not hardened, not colder, just more aware. Behind her a voice spoke. "You didn't sleep, Marcus." Not a question. Fact. She turned. He was still here, still wearing the same shirt, now unbuttoned at the collar. His posture was relaxed but not indifferent. He was watching her in the way only someone who had once chosen restraint over desire could. "Neither did you," she said. He nodded, then walked toward the table, picking up the half-finished espresso from last night. He didn't sip it, just held it. "I stayed because I wanted to understand," he said, his voice calm. "But I think I already do." "Understand what?" "That you weren't asking for any of us to save you. You were just letting us see you. Maybe for the first time." She didn't respond immediately. Then, "Do you regret seeing me?" A pause. "No," he said. "I regret not looking sooner." That stayed in the air, suspended, honest, unembellished. Then Caleb entered the room. His hair was tousled, his expression unreadable. There was a heaviness in his eyes, but not anger. Something quieter. Like someone who had just realized the house he thought was his had never belonged to him at all. "Did Noah leave?" he asked. Elena nodded. Caleb pulled out a chair and sat, hands folded. For once he didn't posture. He didn't ask for clarity. He simply was. "I don't know how we got here," he admitted. "We didn't get here together," Elena said gently. "I arrived. You stayed behind." Silence. "So what happens now?" Caleb asked. Elena looked at him, then Marcus, then the empty chair Noah had occupied. "Now I decide what I do with the space you each left behind." There is a moment in every unraveling where time seems to pause. Not from stillness, but from decision. That fragile point between what was tolerated and what will no longer be. Elena stood near the sink, both hands wrapped around a warm ceramic cup she hadn't yet touched. Outside, the light had softened, filtering through the curtains like a quiet blessing. It was early but not new. Not for her. Marcus and Caleb remained seated at the table like chess pieces left on the board long after the game had ended. She could feel their presence without turning. She didn't need their words to know what they were waiting for. They weren't waiting for her to choose. They were waiting to see if they'd already been unchosen. She set the cup down. "You're both still here," she said without accusation. Marcus offered a faint smile but didn't speak. Caleb exhaled. The sound was almost apologetic. "I stayed because," he began, then stopped. She turned. "Because you're not used to losing," she offered for him. Caleb looked down. Not defeated but disarmed. "Because I thought I had time," he corrected quietly. "You did," she said. "But you spent it elsewhere." Marcus rose from his chair and crossed the room slowly. There was no urgency in his steps, no expectation in his stance. Just a man who had always known how to occupy space without taking too much of it. "And what do you want now, Elena?" he asked. The way he said her name was different from the others. Less of a claim, more of a recognition. She considered the question, not because she didn't know, but because she wanted to answer from the part of herself that had stopped shrinking. "I want presence that doesn't apologize. Attention that isn't conditional, and silence that isn't just avoidance in disguise." Marcus nodded, not in agreement but in understanding. "Then you already know who can give that to you." Elena glanced at the chair Noah had occupied. The only man who hadn't asked for anything, who hadn't stayed, who had known when to leave, and trusted her enough not to try to rewrite the ending. Caleb stood now, too. The room was full of movement but no chaos. Just three people finally speaking without volume. "I know I failed you," Caleb said, not with drama but with truth. Elena didn't correct him. She didn't rush to soften his guilt. She simply listened. "You didn't fail me," she said. "You just weren't with me. Not really. Not when it mattered." Caleb nodded once, slow. His eyes searched hers, not for another chance but for closure. "Then I'll go," he said. She didn't stop him. As he turned, he paused just for a moment. "He might come back, you know." Caleb said softly. Noah. Elena's eyes didn't waver. He doesn't need to. He never really left. And with that, Caleb walked out the door. The silence that followed wasn't awkward or strained. It was clean. Marcus remained, leaning against the wall, arms folded. He wasn't in a rush. And she wasn't asking him to be. You don't need to say anything, she told him. Good, he said. Because for once, I just want to watch what you do next. Elena crossed the room, picked up her cup again. It was no longer warm, but it didn't matter. She looked out the window, her reflection blurred but standing tall. What I do next, she said mostly to herself, will be mine. Entirely. It wasn't quiet because the apartment was empty. It was quiet because Elena had stopped needing noise to prove that she was not alone. Marcus had left shortly after Caleb, without a dramatic farewell, without promises. Just a long look. A quiet pause in the doorway. And a parting sentence that didn't ask for a reply. Call me if you ever want to be seen again, not saved. Then the door closed, and she was left with the hum of the fridge, the faint creak of the floor under her bare feet, and the soft crackle of a forgotten candle wick, still smoldering into wax. She walked through the space like a curator in a gallery of memories. Each chair, each glass, each shadow a frozen fragment of something undone. Her fingertips brushed the back of the chair where Caleb had sat, then the rim of the wine glass Marcus had never emptied. Her eyes paused on Noah's chair, still pushed in neatly, as though he had known from the beginning he would leave quietly. Elena exhaled slowly, not a sigh, a release. She didn't need to cry. The grief she carried wasn't jagged. It was smooth now, softened by time and recognition. She hadn't lost anyone. She had just let go. She walked to the mirror in the hallway. It wasn't about vanity. It wasn't even about reassurance. It was a ritual. A way to look into her own eyes and ask the questions others were too afraid to pose. What did you give away? What did you keep? And was the exchange worth it? She didn't have all the answers. But she had one. I kept myself. And that, for the first time in a long while, felt like enough. The day passed slowly. She cleaned the dishes without rushing, folded the napkins with care, put the espresso cups back into their box as though tucking away something sacred. She changed the sheets on her bed, not because she needed to, but because she wanted something new beneath her when she next closed her eyes. The sky turned the color of quiet bruises, lavender and gray. She lit a candle, not for romance, not for memory, just for light, just for presence. And then without ceremony she sat, not waiting, not hoping, just being. And it was in that stillness, right there in the center of a room no longer shared, that she understood what reckoning truly was. Not confrontation, not revenge, not even closure. It was the moment you stopped needing anyone else to witness your transformation, and do it anyway. For no one, for everyone, for yourself. There were no more footsteps in the hallway, no knocks, no returns, no messages sent to ask, "Are you okay?" And that was its own kind of answer. Elena stood at the window as the city shifted beneath her, lives moving in quiet choreography, unaware of the stillness that had taken hold in her home, in her heart, in her spine. She wrapped a soft cardigan around herself, not for warmth but for grounding. The fabric was worn, familiar. It didn't ask her to perform. It simply held her the way no one had last night, and the way no one needed to. There had been no explosions, no final confessions, only exits, and silence, and breath. It was enough. She had kissed 3 men, each for a different reason. Caleb to see what was left, Marcus to honor what was never quite begun, Noah to acknowledge what had always been quietly true. None of them stayed, but for once that felt less like abandonment and more like space being returned to her. Like room to stretch, room to decide. And this was the decision. She wasn't waiting anymore. Not for someone to prove they were worthy of her trust. Not for someone to explain their absence. Not even for love to come in a shape she recognized. She walked to the bookshelf and ran her fingers across the spines, not looking for anything in particular. Just reminding herself of who she used to be. Of the woman who once lost herself in words because her world had no voice for her. Now she did. She pulled out a notebook. Not the one where she had written about them, but the blank one. The one she had bought and never touched because she was afraid of what she might fill it with. She opened it to the first page and wrote one sentence. There is no love worth choosing if it asks you to leave yourself behind. She underlined it, then closed the book. That was enough for now. There would be other nights, other people, other silences that didn't bruise. But for now, her solitude wasn't loneliness. It was proof that she had come back to herself, not through a grand gesture, not through anyone's confession, but through small choices, hard ones. And that was the price, but it was also the reward. This story is a fictional work inspired by emotional dynamics. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental.